Upon arriving to deliver a package, the delivery girl froze when she saw her mother's photo in a black frame on the Millionaire'S living room wall. What she said left him speechless. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Santa Fe's cracked asphalt as Sofia Bennett pedaled her worn-out bicycle through the narrow streets that separated two worlds. At 23, she'd memorized every pothole, every shortcut, every safe corner where she could catch her breath between deliveries. Her messenger bag bounced against her hip, heavy with packages that represented more than just parcels. They were lifelines. Each delivery fee another day her mother could stay in treatment. Sofia's legs burned as she pushed harder up the steep incline toward downtown. The rusty chain of her bike groaned in protest, a sound she'd grown accustomed to over the past 18 months since everything fell apart. Before her mother got sick, Sofia had dreams. College applications sitting half-finished in her desk drawer, a scholarship to study journalism that she'd had to turn down. Now her world had shrunk to the space between home, the hospital, and the endless network of streets where people paid her $5 to carry what they couldn't be bothered to pick up themselves. "Come on, girl," she whispered to her bike, patting the handlebars like she would a tired horse. "Just a few more stops today." The contrast hit her like a slap every time she crossed the invisible line dividing Santa Fe. Behind her lay the neighborhoods where laundry hung on fire escapes, where corner stores sold single cigarettes, and hope came in lottery ticket form. Ahead stretched Laurel Heights, where perfectly manicured lawns whispered of old money and newer money trying to look old. The houses here didn't have addresses. They had names, carved into stone pillars that guarded driveways longer than most people's streets. Sofia slowed her bike as she entered this foreign territory, suddenly conscious of how her faded jeans and sweat-stained t-shirt must look to anyone watching from behind those pristine windows. She'd been delivering to Laurel Heights for 6 months now, but she still felt like an intruder every single time. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother's nurse. "Lucia is asking for you. Try to come by before evening shift change." Sofia's chest tightened. Her mother had been asking for her more frequently lately, their conversations becoming increasingly urgent, as if Lucia was trying to tell her something important, but couldn't find the words, or maybe didn't want to find them. The Hopewell Medical Center had become Sofia's second home, though she hated every sterile inch of it. Room 314 was where her mother spent her days connected to machines that beeped and hummed, fighting a battle that seemed more hopeless with each passing week. The doctors spoke in careful, measured sentences about treatment options and quality of life, but Sofia could read between their clinical lines. Time was running out. She pulled up to a red light and checked her delivery list. 3 more stops before she could head to the hospital. The biggest delivery was saved for last, a package going to the Blake mansion, the crown jewel of Laurel Heights. She'd never been inside the gates before, only heard whispers about the reclusive millionaire who lived there like some kind of modern-day hermit. "Sofia Bennett, you raised one hell of a fighter," Sofia said to herself, the way she always did when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush her. It was something her mother used to say when Sofia was little and facing down playground bullies or difficult math tests. Now she said it to herself when the world felt too big and her shoulders too small. The light turned green, and Sofia pushed forward into the maze of Laurel Heights. Each house told a story of success. The tech mogul's modern glass fortress, the oil executive's southern colonial, the pharmaceutical heiress's Victorian mansion that looked like it had been airlifted from a fairy tale. But success, Sofia had learned, didn't always mean happiness. She delivered enough packages to these houses to know that money couldn't fill every empty space in a person's life. Her mother had never talked much about Sofia's father. Whenever Sofia brought it up as a child, Lucia would get that distant look in her eyes, like she was seeing something far away and painful. "He couldn't stay, mija," was all she'd ever say. Sometimes people can't stay, no matter how much they want to. Sofia had stopped asking by the time she turned 16. What was the point? She had her mother, and her mother had her, and that was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all they had. But lately, in those long hours sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, Sofia found herself wondering again, who was he? Did he know about her? Did he ever think about the daughter he'd never met? Or the woman he'd left behind to raise a child alone? The Blake mansion appeared ahead like something out of a movie. All iron gates and stone columns and windows that caught the afternoon light like golden eyes. Sofia had heard the stories. Jonathan Blake, the hotel magnate who'd built his empire from nothing and then retreated into it like a fortress. They said he'd never married, never had children, never seemed to want anything but the solitude his money could buy. Sofia checked the address twice before pressing the intercom button. A crackling voice answered, and the gate swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo her bicycle's protests. She pedaled up the circular driveway, her worn sneakers silent against the perfect asphalt. The package in her bag felt heavier than it should. Another delivery, another $5. Another small victory in her daily battle to keep her mother alive. She didn't know that in 5 minutes. Everything she thought she knew about her life would shatter like glass against marble, leaving her standing in a stranger's house, staring at her own face in a photograph that should have been impossible. The mansion's front door was already opening as she approached, and Sofia Bennett pedaled toward a truth that had been waiting 23 years to find her. The front door of the Blake mansion opened before Sofia could even dismount her bicycle. A man emerged from the shadows of the marble foyer, tall, distinguished, with salt and pepper hair that spoke of sleepless nights and shoulders that carried invisible weight. At 45, Jonathan Blake moved like someone who'd forgotten how to be young, each step measured and deliberate. "You're early," he said, his voice carrying the kind of roughness that comes from too much solitude and not enough conversation. His eyes, a striking shade of green, swept over Sofia's bicycle and messenger bag with the detached observation of someone who'd grown accustomed to keeping the world at arm's length. "Sorry, Mr. Blake. Traffic was lighter than expected." Sofia swung her leg over the bike and pulled the package from her bag. "Signature required for this one." Jonathan nodded and gestured toward the entrance. "Come in. I'll sign for it inside." Sofia hesitated. In all her months of deliveries to Laurel Heights, she'd never been invited past a threshold. Most rich folks preferred to keep the help on the doorstep, as if poverty might be contagious. But something in Jonathan's manner, tired, resigned, almost lonely, made her follow him through the massive oak doors. The interior took her breath away. Marble floors stretched like a frozen lake, reflecting the light from crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than her mother's entire medical bill. Persian rugs created islands of warmth on the cold stone, and oil paintings in gilded frames watched from the walls like silent judges. But despite all the luxury, the house felt empty, like a museum after closing time. "Impressive place," Sofia said, mainly because the silence felt too heavy to carry alone. "It's just a house," Jonathan replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "The main hall is through here." They walked through an archway into a grand salon that belonged in European royalty, not modern-day Santa Fe. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in streams of golden afternoon light, and a marble fireplace dominated one wall like an altar. But it was what hung above the fireplace that made Sofia's world stop spinning. The package slipped from her fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sound like breaking glass, which, in a way, it was. The sound of Sofia's life as she knew it, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Above the fireplace, in an ornate frame of black velvet and gold, hung a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and almond-shaped eyes. A woman with Sofia's exact face. Sofia's smile. Sofia's everything. Down to the small scar above the left eyebrow that Sofia had gotten falling off her bike at age 7. "That's..." Sofia's voice came out as a whisper, then died entirely. Her hands trembled as she raised them to her own face, as if checking to make sure she was still real, still herself. Jonathan had been reaching for his pen when the package fell. Now he looked up to see what had caused the disturbance, and the pen slipped from his fingers too, clattering against the marble like an echo of Sofia's shock. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they stared at each other, the young woman and the older man, both frozen by an impossible recognition. Jonathan's face drained of color, his eyes wide with something that looked like seeing a ghost. "Who are you?" The words escaped him in a hoarse whisper, and he took a step closer, then another, as if drawn by invisible strings. "What's your name?" "Sofia," she managed, still staring at the photograph. "Sofia Bennett. My mother is Lucia Bennett." The name hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He staggered backward, catching himself against the fireplace mantel, his knuckles white where they gripped the marble. "Lucia," he breathed. And the way he said it, like a prayer, like a curse, like the answer to a question that had been tormenting him for decades. "You know her." Sofia's voice cracked. "You know my mother." Jonathan's eyes never left Sofia's face, scanning every feature as if memorizing it, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had been missing its most crucial piece. "I knew her. I loved her. 24 years ago. I loved her more than I thought it was possible to love another human being." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished flame. Sofia felt dizzy, disconnected from her own body. The photograph seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision, that impossible image of her own face staring down at her from a past she'd never known existed. "She worked at downtown Bloom's," Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger as if speaking the truth after so many years of silence was giving him strength. "The flower shop on Broad Street. I used to buy flowers there every week, just to see her smile. She had this way of arranging roses that made them look like they were dancing." Sofia knew that flower shop. It had closed when she was a teenager, but she remembered passing it as a child, remembered her mother always walking a little faster when they approached that particular corner, her grip on Sofia's hand tightening just slightly. "We were going to run away together," Jonathan said, and now the words came pouring out like water from a broken dam. "To Las Vegas, maybe California, somewhere her family couldn't find us, somewhere mine couldn't stop us. She was pregnant." His voice broke. "We were going to have a baby." The room spun around Sofia. Pregnant 24 years ago. The math was simple, brutal, undeniable. "What happened?" Sofia whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would destroy whatever was left of the world she thought she understood. Jonathan's laugh was bitter, hollow. "She left. One morning I woke up to find a letter slipped under my door, cold as ice, formal as a business transaction. She said she'd realized she didn't love me, that she was leaving town, that I should forget about her and the baby. But that's not..." Sofia started to protest, then stopped. What did she know, really? Her mother had always been vague about the past, always changed the subject when Sofia asked about her father. "I searched for her for years," Jonathan continued, his eyes distant with memory. "Hired private investigators, followed every lead, checked every hospital and courthouse in 3 states. It was like she'd vanished into thin air, taking my heart and my child with her. My child." The words echoed in Sofia's mind as she stared up at the photograph of her mother's young face. Her mother, who'd never talked about the past. Her mother, who got that haunted look whenever certain topics came up. Her mother, who was dying in a hospital bed while Sofia worked herself to exhaustion trying to pay for treatments that might not even work. "She never left town," Sofia said quietly, the revelation falling between them like a stone into still water. "She's been here the whole time. She's been here, and she's dying, and she never told me about you." Jonathan's face went completely white. "Dying," Sofia nodded, tears she didn't remember starting now streaming down her cheeks. "Cancer, stage 4, the doctors say." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't make the words real by speaking them aloud. In the silence that followed, the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4 o'clock, marking time in a world that had just shifted on its axis. Sofia Bennett, the girl who'd thought she knew her story, stood in a mansion she'd never seen before, looking at a photograph of her mother's youth, talking to a man who might be her father. And somewhere across town, in room 314 of Hopewell Medical Center, Lucia Bennett lay in her hospital bed, carrying secrets that were finally, inevitably, coming home. 24 years earlier, the bells above the door of downtown Bloom's chimed like wedding music every time Jonathan Blake stepped inside. Though he didn't know yet that he was falling in love with the sound, it was March of 1999, and spring was painting Santa Fe in shades of hope that matched the feeling blooming in his chest. Every time he saw Lucia Santos behind the counter, she was arranging white roses when he first walked in, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight that streamed through the shop's front windows, 21 years old and beautiful in a way that made his breath catch. Not the polished beauty of the women his mother kept trying to introduce him to at country club events, but something real and warm and alive. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up with those almond-shaped eyes that would haunt his dreams for the next 2 decades. Jonathan, 21 himself and usually confident to the point of arrogance, found himself speechless. He was home from business school for spring break, already groomed to take over a piece of his family's growing hotel empire, already engaged to marry into another wealthy Santa Fe family by summer's end. But none of that mattered when Lucia smiled at him. "I need flowers," he managed, which was perhaps the most obvious thing anyone had ever said in a flower shop. "What kind of occasion?" she asked, her fingers still working magic with the roses, turning them into something that looked like poetry. "No occasion. I like flowers," Lucia laughed, and the sound was like water over stones, natural and musical. "Most guys your age don't just like flowers. You sure you're not trying to apologize to somebody?" "Should I be?" "That depends. Have you done something worth apologizing for?" Jonathan found himself grinning. "Not yet, but the day is young." That first conversation lasted 20 minutes. Jonathan walked out with a bouquet of mixed wildflowers and a feeling in his chest that he'd never experienced before, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, talking to exactly the person he was meant to meet. He came back the next day, and the next, each time with a different excuse. Flowers for his mother, for his office, for his car. Lucia teased him about his sudden botanical enthusiasm, but she never asked him to stop coming. By the end of the week, Jonathan had abandoned all pretense. "I don't actually need flowers today," he admitted, standing in front of her counter like a defendant before a judge. "I know," Lucia said, not looking up from the baby's breath she was trimming. "You never did. Then why do you keep selling them to me?" She finally met his eyes, and Jonathan saw something there that made his heart race. "Because you keep buying them, and because you're the only customer who actually listens when I tell you about the flowers. Most people just want pretty arrangements. You want to know why I choose certain combinations, what each flower means." "What do they mean?" Lucia set down her scissors and moved closer to the counter, close enough that Jonathan could smell her shampoo. Something simple and clean, like rain on desert sage. "The white roses I was working with when you first came in, they mean new beginnings. The wildflowers you bought, those mean I'm thinking of you, in flower language. And what about these?" Jonathan reached across the counter and touched the yellow tulips she'd been arranging. "Those mean hopeless love," Lucia said quietly, and suddenly, the air between them felt charged with electricity. Jonathan's engagement to Rebecca Montoya was announced in the Santa Fe New Mexican 2 weeks later. His parents had arranged it all, the perfect merger of two prominent families, complete with a summer wedding at the country club and a honeymoon in Europe. Jonathan went through the motions of the engagement party like a sleepwalker, accepting congratulations and enduring Rebecca's possessive hand on his arm, all while thinking about a girl who spoke in flower language and made him feel more alive than he'd ever felt before. He stopped going to downtown Bloom's after the engagement announcement. It seemed cruel to continue, cruel to both Lucia and to himself, but 3 days into his self-imposed exile, she appeared at his apartment door. "You stopped coming," she said simply. "I got engaged. I saw the announcement in the paper." Lucia looked down at her hands, then back up at his face. "Are you happy?" Jonathan opened his mouth to say yes, to give the expected answer, to maintain the fiction that his life was proceeding according to plan. Instead, he heard himself say, "No, I've never been less happy in my life." She stepped inside his apartment then, and Jonathan closed the door behind her, sealing them both into a moment that would change everything. "I love you," he said, because there was no point in pretending anymore. No point in protecting either of them from the truth. "I love you too," she whispered, and when he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place he'd never been, but had always been searching for. They had 3 months. 3 months of secret meetings, stolen afternoons, whispered plans for a future that seemed impossible but felt more real than anything else in Jonathan's carefully orchestrated life. Lucia would meet him at his apartment after the flower shop closed, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. Her dreams of traveling, his desire to build something meaningful rather than just inherit wealth, their shared love of old movies and Mexican food, and the way the desert looked at sunset. "We could go anywhere," Jonathan said one evening in June, holding her in his arms as rain drummed against his windows. "California, New York, anywhere we want. Your family would disown you. Let them. I don't want their money if it means I can't have you." Lucia was quiet for a long moment. "My family depends on me. My mother cleans houses. My father works construction when he can find it. I send them money every month. We'll send them more money. I have my own trust fund. Not much by my family's standards, but enough for us to start somewhere new, enough to take care of everyone we love. When Lucia told him she was pregnant in early July, Jonathan felt like his heart might explode with joy. He proposed that same night, not with his grandmother's ring that Rebecca was already wearing, but with a simple band he bought at a pawn shop on the south side of town. "We'll leave next week," he said, spinning her around his apartment kitchen. "Vegas first, then California. We'll get married, find a place near the ocean for the baby to grow up." Lucia's smile was radiant. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They set the date. July 15th, 1999. Jonathan would pick her up at dawn, and they would drive west toward their new life. He had already withdrawn money from his trust fund, already written his resignation letter from the family business, already bought a ring that actually meant something. On July 14th, he went to bed happier than he'd ever been, dreaming of Lucia and their baby, and the life they were going to build together. On July 15th, he woke up to find a letter slipped under his door. "Jonathan, I have realized that I do not love you the way you deserve to be loved. I am leaving Santa Fe today, and I will not be returning. Please do not try to find me. I wish you happiness with Rebecca. Lucia." The handwriting was hers, but the words felt like they'd been written by a stranger. Cold, formal, nothing like the woman who whispered "I love you" in Spanish against his neck, who planned baby names and talked about teaching their child to love flowers. Jonathan ran to downtown Bloom's, but it was closed. He went to her family's house, but they said she'd left before dawn with a single suitcase, saying only that she had to go away for a while. She was gone. Lucia and their baby vanished like morning mist, leaving only a letter that felt like a lie and a hole in Jonathan's chest that never quite healed. He married Rebecca that summer as planned, though the marriage lasted only 2 years before she left him for someone who could love her the way she deserved. He never found Lucia, never stopped looking, never stopped wondering what had really happened that July morning when love turned to abandonment. Without warning, now, 24 years later, standing in his marble-floored mansion and staring at a young woman who had Lucia's eyes and his own stubborn chin, Jonathan finally understood that some mysteries were worth waiting a lifetime to solve. The Blake family estate sat on Meridian Hill like a monument to old money and older secrets. Jonathan's hands shook on the steering wheel as he pulled into the circular driveway, the weight of Sophia's revelation still crushing down on his chest. Lucia was alive, had been alive all these years, living in the same city where he'd searched for her like a man possessed, and she was dying. He sat in his car for a full 5 minutes, staring at the house where he'd grown up, where family portraits lined the walls like silent witnesses to 24 years of lies. Somewhere inside that house was his mother, Evelyn Blake, the woman who'd raised him to believe that bloodline and bank accounts were the only things that mattered in life. The woman who might have answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Jonathan found his mother in the sunroom, the same place she'd held court every afternoon for the past decade since her stroke. At 78, Evelyn Blake remained formidable despite the wheelchair that had become her throne. Her silver hair was pulled back in its customary chignon, her makeup perfectly applied. Even though she rarely had visitors anymore, she was reading the financial section of the newspaper, because Evelyn Blake didn't believe in wasting time on anything that didn't involve money or power. Jonathan? She looked up with surprise. He rarely visited anymore, their relationship having cooled to polite distance after his father's death 5 years earlier. "This is unexpected. To what do I occasion owe this visit?" Jonathan closed the sunroom door behind him and took the chair across from her wheelchair. His mother's sharp blue eyes studied his face with the intensity that had once cowed boardrooms full of grown men. "You look upset, dear. Business troubles?" "I found her," Jonathan said quietly. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, quick as lightning, gone before it could be properly identified. "Found whom?" "Don't." Jonathan's voice carried a warning his mother had never heard before. "Don't play games with me. Not about this. I found Lucia." The newspaper slipped from Evelyn's hands, falling to the floor with a rustle that seemed deafeningly loud in the suddenly silent room. For a moment, The mask of control that Evelyn had worn for nearly 8 decades cracked just slightly, revealing something that looked almost like fear. "Jonathan, I don't know what you think. She has a daughter." The words came out like bullets. "A 23-year-old daughter who looks exactly like her, who looks exactly like me." Evelyn's face went pale beneath her carefully applied rouge. Her hands, usually steady as surgical instruments, began to tremble in her lap. "A daughter," Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "My daughter. The daughter you told me never existed, because Lucia supposedly left town before she could tell me she was pregnant. Except she didn't leave town, did she, Mother? She's been here the whole time. Jonathan, she's dying." The words exploded from him. "She's been fighting cancer for months, and her daughter has been working herself to death trying to pay for treatments. My daughter has been struggling to save her mother's life, while I've been living in my mansion feeling sorry for myself because the woman I loved supposedly abandoned me." Evelyn's composure finally shattered completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, carrying her makeup with them, and leaving trails of black mascara like scars. She aged 10 years in 10 seconds, the weight of buried guilt finally surfacing after decades of suppression. "How could you?" Jonathan whispered, and his voice broke like a child's. "How could you do that to her? To me? To your own granddaughter? We thought..." Evelyn's voice was barely audible. "We thought we were protecting you. We, your father and I, we found out about the girl, about the pregnancy. We couldn't allow it, Jonathan. You were engaged to Rebecca. The Montoya family was counting on the merger. Your future was already planned." Jonathan stared at his mother, as if seeing her for the first time. "So you what? Threatened her?" Evelyn closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with a pain that looked like it had been growing for 24 years. "We went to her apartment, your father and I. We told her that if she didn't disappear, if she didn't give up any claim to you or the Blake name, we would destroy her family. Her father was working illegally. We threatened to have him deported. Her mother was cleaning houses under the table. We threatened to have her arrested for tax evasion." Jesus Christ! Jonathan stood up so abruptly his chair fell backward. "You blackmailed a pregnant woman. We told her we would take the baby." Evelyn continued, her voice growing smaller with each word. "We said we would use our money and lawyers to prove she was an unfit mother. We would take her child and give it to a proper family. And she would never see it again." The sunroom felt like it was closing in around Jonathan. He thought of Lucia at 21, pregnant and scared, facing down 2 of the most powerful people in Santa Fe. He thought of Sofia on her bicycle, exhausting herself to pay medical bills while her grandfather's money sat in trust funds she didn't even know existed. "The letter?" he said. "We wrote it. She refused at first, said she would rather die than leave you. So we made her watch, while your father called immigration about her family. We had them on speed dial, Jonathan. 1 phone call, and her entire family would have been destroyed. So she agreed." Evelyn nodded, tears still streaming. "She made us promise that you would never know about the baby. She said if we told you, she would come back and fight for custody no matter what happened to her family. She said she would rather you live your planned life than know you had a child you couldn't be with. And you've been paying her. It wasn't a question. Every month for 23 years. Anonymous cashier's checks. We told her it was to make sure the child had what she needed. But really it was conscience money. Blood money." Jonathan walked to the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured gardens where he'd played as a child, back when he'd believed his family was good and honorable and worthy of respect. The irony wasn't lost on him that his trust fund, money he'd been willing to abandon for love, had been quietly subsidizing his daughter's life while he grieved for a relationship he thought had been a lie. "She named her Sofia," he said to the window. "I know, we had someone check on them occasionally, just to make sure the child was healthy, that Lucia was keeping her end of the bargain. You had us watched. We had them watched. You got on with your life. You married Rebecca, divorced Rebecca, built your business, we thought. We thought you'd forgotten about her." Jonathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Forgotten? I never dated another woman seriously. I built an empire and lived in it like a tomb, thinking about her every single day. I've been a ghost for 24 years, Mother. A ghost haunting my own life. He turned back to face his mother, this woman who'd shaped his world, and then systematically destroyed the best parts of it. She's dying, and my daughter doesn't even know I exist. Sofia thinks her father couldn't be bothered to stay around. How did you find out? She delivered a package to my house today. She saw the photograph of Lucia that I keep above the fireplace, the photograph you've seen 1,000 times and never said a word about. Evelyn's face crumpled. I wanted to tell you so many times, especially after your father died. The guilt has been eating me alive, Jonathan. I wake up every night thinking about that girl, about what we did to her, about what we stole from you, what you stole from Sofia. Jonathan corrected. She's the real victim here. She grew up without a father, because you and Dad decided you knew better than God himself what my life should look like. Can you forgive me? Evelyn whispered. Jonathan looked at his mother, really looked at her. She was old, sick, fragile in her wheelchair, carrying a burden that had clearly been crushing her for decades. He thought about forgiveness, about mercy, about the complicated mathematics of love and hate and family obligation, but mostly he thought about Sofia, pedaling her beat-up bicycle through Santa Fe while her mother died in a hospital room, and forgiveness felt like a luxury he couldn't afford yet. I don't know, he said finally. Ask me again after I've met my daughter properly, after I've had a chance to be her father, if she'll let me, after I've said goodbye to the woman I've loved for 24 years. He walked toward the door, then paused. If Lucia dies without knowing that I know the truth, without knowing that I never stopped loving her, I will never forgive you. Never. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Evelyn Blake alone with her tears and her guilt, and the crushing weight of secrets that had finally come home to destroy everything she'd thought she was protecting. The bicycle ride back to Hopewell Medical Center felt like pedaling through a dream where all the familiar landmarks had shifted slightly to the left. Sofia gripped the handlebars so tightly her knuckles went white, her mind racing faster than the worn wheels carrying her through downtown Santa Fe. The package delivery that should have earned her $5 had instead cracked open her entire life like an egg, spilling out 23 years of secrets she wasn't sure she was ready to hold. Jonathan Blake, the name echoed in her head with each pump of the pedals. The man in the photograph was her father, not some faceless stranger who'd abandoned her mother, but a flesh and blood person with green eyes that matched her own and a voice that cracked when he talked about love lost. A man who'd searched for her mother for years while Lucia pretended he'd never existed. The hospital's antiseptic smell hit Sofia like a wall when she walked through the automatic doors of Hopewell Medical Center. She'd grown to hate that smell. Bleach and industrial disinfectant mixed with something that was supposed to be floral, but just smelled like desperation. It was the smell of people fighting battles they weren't sure they could win. "You're early today," said Margaret, the afternoon nurse who'd become almost like family over the past months. "Your mom's been asking for you since lunch." Sofia nodded, not trusting her voice. Everything felt different now. The worn linoleum floors, the fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical fatigue, even Margaret's kind smile. It was all the same. But Sofia was different, and that changed everything. Room 314 was at the end of the hall, past the visitors' lounge where families huddled around vending machine coffee and whispered prayers to whatever gods might be listening. Sofia paused outside her mother's door, her hand on the handle, trying to figure out how to look at the woman who'd raised her without revealing that the entire foundation of their life together had just shifted. Lucia was awake, propped up against pillows that dwarfed her shrinking frame. The cancer had stolen 20 pounds from her already small body, but her dark eyes, Sofia's eyes, were still bright with the fierce intelligence that had helped her survive 23 years of carrying impossible secrets. "Mija," Lucia smiled, and Sofia's heart clenched. That smile had been her anchor through childhood scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks, through college applications they couldn't afford and dreams they'd had to postpone. It was the same smile that had looked down at her from Jonathan Blake's fireplace, frozen in time and framed in velvet. "Hi, Mom." Sofia kissed her mother's forehead and settled into the plastic chair that had molded itself to her body over months of vigils. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I've been hit by a truck, then backed over by the same truck for good measure." Lucia's laugh was weak but genuine. "But enough about me. How was your day? You look different." "Upset." Sofia's throat tightened. Her mother's ability to read her emotions had always been uncanny, as if 23 years of just the two of them had created some kind of psychic connection. Now Sofia wondered if that intuition was really guilt wearing the mask of maternal love. "Just tired," Sofia lied. "Busy day. Lots of deliveries." Lucia studied her daughter's face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read between lines out of necessity. "Where did you deliver today?" The question felt loaded, though Sofia couldn't be sure if that was paranoia or perception. "The usual places, downtown, some of the neighborhoods up north. Nothing special." "Nothing special," Lucia repeated, but her fingers picked at the hospital blanket in a way that Sofia recognized as nervous habit. "That's good. Sometimes the best days are the quiet ones." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, but the quiet felt different today, heavy with unspoken words and unasked questions. Sofia found herself studying her mother's face, looking for traces of the young woman who'd smiled from Jonathan's photograph. The bone structure was the same, the shape of her eyes, but illness had carved new lines around her mouth and shadows under her cheekbones. "Mom," Sofia said carefully, "can I ask you something?" Lucia's fingers stopped picking at the blanket. "Of course, mija. You can ask me anything. Tell me about my father." The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that seemed to reach every corner. Lucia's face went very still, the way it always did when this subject came up. But there was something else there now, something that looked almost like fear. "Sofia, we've talked about this. Your father. He wasn't ready to be a father. He couldn't stay. But what was he like? I mean, before he left, you must have loved him, right? You must have thought he loved you." Lucia's eyes filled with tears so quickly that Sofia was startled. In all her years of asking about her father, she'd never seen her mother cry about him. Lucia had always just gotten that distant, shuttered look and changed the subject. "Misha, why are you asking this now?" "Because you're sick," Sofia said, surprised by her own honesty. "Because I'm tired of not knowing where I come from. Because I'm 23 years old, and I don't even know my father's name. His name doesn't matter. It matters to me." Sofia leaned forward in her chair, studying her mother's face. "Mom, I've never pushed you about this, but I need to know. Did he know about me? Did he know you were pregnant when he left?" Lucia closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with something that looked like 23 years of accumulated pain. "No," she whispered. "He didn't know." Sofia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Why didn't you tell him?" "Because," Lucia's voice broke, "because I couldn't. Because it was complicated, mija. More complicated than you can understand. Try me for a moment." Sofia thought her mother might actually tell her the truth. Lucia opened her mouth, started to speak, then seemed to catch herself. The shuttered look came down over her features like a curtain. "Sofia, some things are better left in the past. Your father, he had a different life, a life that didn't include us. Us. But if he didn't know about me, he had obligations to his family, to his future. I was a detour for him, a temporary distraction." Sofia stared at her mother, and for the first time in her life, she was certain that Lucia was lying, not just omitting details or being vague, but actively, deliberately lying. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. "Mom, if there's something you need to tell me..." The door opened, interrupting Sofia's question. Margaret stuck her head in, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a gentleman here asking about visiting hours. Says he's a friend of the family." Sofia's heart stopped. "What does he look like?" "Tall, well-dressed, salt and pepper hair. Says his name is Jonathan." The blood drained from Lucia's face so quickly that Sofia thought she might faint. Her mother's hands clutched the blanket like lifelines, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. "No," Lucia whispered. "No, he can't. Tell him I'm sleeping. Tell him visiting hours are over. Tell him..." "Mom," Sofia's voice was gentle but firm. "I know who he is." Lucia's eyes widened, and Sofia saw 23 years of carefully constructed lies crumbling in real time. "You know, I delivered a package to his house today. I saw your photograph, Mom. I saw myself in his house, and he told me about downtown blooms, about the roses, about how much he loved you. Tears spilled down Lucia's cheeks unchecked. Mija, you don't understand. It's not that simple. It was never that simple. Then explain it to me, Sofia said. Please, I'm begging you, let him come in here and explain to me why my father has been living 20 miles away my entire life while you let me think he didn't want us. Through the small window in the door, Sofia could see a tall figure pacing in the hallway. Jonathan Blake, the stranger who was her father, the man who'd loved her mother enough to put her photograph above his fireplace for 24 years, the man who was about to learn that the love of his life was dying, and that he had a daughter who'd grown up thinking she wasn't wanted. Lucia looked from Sofia to the door and back again, and Sofia saw the exact moment when her mother realized that the secrets she'd spent 2 decades protecting were finally, inevitably, about to come to light. Let him in, Lucia whispered, her voice so quiet Sofia almost didn't hear it. Let him in, and God help us all. The hospital room door opened slowly, as if the person on the other side was afraid of what lay beyond. Jonathan Blake stepped into the sterile space carrying 24 years of unanswered questions and a heart that had never quite learned how to beat properly without the woman now lying in the narrow bed before him. Time collapsed, the machines beeping around Lucia's bed. Sofia's sharp intake of breath, the antiseptic smell of the hospital. All of it faded into background noise as Jonathan's eyes found Lucia's face. Cancer had changed her, stolen the fullness from her cheeks and the shine from her hair. But those almond-shaped eyes were exactly the same. They held the same depth, the same intelligence, the same capacity for love that had made him fall apart and rebuild himself around her memory. "Hello, Jonathan," Lucia said, her voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. 24 years of imagined conversations, of things he'd wanted to say to her, of anger and grief and desperate love, and now all he could do was stand in the doorway like a statue. Sofia looked between her parents. The word felt strange in her mind. Parents, plural, a concept she'd never quite believed could apply to her, and saw the exact moment when everything else in the world ceased to exist for them. It was like watching 2 stars collide, creating something beautiful and devastating all at once. "I'll give you two some privacy," Sofia started to say, but Lucia's voice stopped her. "No." Lucia's hand reached out, seeking Sofia's fingers. "Stay, Mija. Please. You need to hear this too." Jonathan finally found his legs, crossing the small room in 3 strides to reach the side of Lucia's bed. Up close, he could see how fragile she'd become, how the disease had carved hollows in her face and turned her skin translucent. But when she looked at him, he saw the 21-year-old woman who'd rearranged flowers like poetry and whispered, "I love you," in Spanish against his neck. "You're sick," he said, the words coming out like an accusation. "I'm dying," Lucia corrected gently. "There's a difference." "How long?" "The doctors say weeks, maybe a month if I'm lucky." Lucia's fingers tightened around Sofia's hand. "But seeing you here, seeing you both here together, maybe that's all the luck I need." Jonathan pulled a chair close to the bed, so close his knees touched the mattress. "Why didn't you tell me all these years?" "Lucia, I searched for you. I hired investigators. I checked every hospital, every courthouse. I never stopped looking." Tears spilled down Lucia's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Because I couldn't. Because they made it impossible. They, your parents." The words came out like broken glass. "Your mother and father. They came to my apartment 3 days before we were supposed to leave together. They told me what would happen if I didn't disappear." Sofia watched her father's face cycle through confusion, understanding, and then a rage so pure it seemed to light him up from the inside. "What did they tell you? That they would destroy my family? My father was working without papers. They threatened to have him deported. My mother was cleaning houses under the table. They said they'd have her arrested. They had lawyers, Jonathan. They had money and power and connections, and I was just a girl who worked in a flower shop. So you left." Jonathan's voice was hollow. "I tried to refuse. I told them I'd rather die than leave you, so they..." Lucia's voice broke. "So they said they would take the baby. They said they would prove in court that I was an unfit mother, that a girl from my background couldn't possibly raise a Blake heir properly. They said they would take my child and give her to a proper family, and I would never see her again. The silence that followed was deafening. Sofia felt like she was watching her entire life get rewritten in real time. Every assumption she'd ever made about her family, her worth, her place in the world, crumbling like old paper. "They wrote the letter," Jonathan said, "and it wasn't a question. They made me watch them write it, made me sign it. They said if I ever contacted you, if I ever told you about Sofia, they would follow through on their threats. But they also said," Lucia's voice dropped to a whisper, "they said they would make sure we were taken care of. Anonymous payments, enough to keep us comfortable. Blood money. But I took it because it meant Sofia could have what she needed." Jonathan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot where ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, unaware that in room 314, 24 years of lies were finally being burned away. "I could have protected you," he said to the glass. "If you'd told me what they were threatening, I could have fought them." "With what?" Lucia's voice was gentle but firm. "You were 21 years old, Jonathan. They controlled your trust fund, your future, everything. And I was pregnant and scared, and I believed them when they said they could destroy everyone I loved. So you sacrificed yourself. I sacrificed us, both of us, because I thought it was the only way to keep Sofia safe." Sofia found her voice for the first time since her father had entered the room. "But I wasn't safe," she said quietly. "I grew up thinking my father didn't want me. I grew up thinking I wasn't worth staying for." Both her parents turned to look at her, and Sofia saw identical expressions of heartbreak on their faces. "Mija," Lucia whispered. "I'm so sorry. I thought it was better for you to think he chose to leave than to know he'd been forced away. I thought if you believed he didn't want us, at least you wouldn't spend your life hoping he'd come back. But he did want us," Sofia said, looking at Jonathan. "You've been looking for us all this time." Jonathan returned to his chair, and this time he reached out to take Lucia's other hand. "Every day, I never stopped loving your mother, and I never stopped wondering about you. I have investigators on retainer even now, still looking for traces of where you might have gone. We never left Santa Fe," Sofia said. "We've been here the whole time. I know that now." Jonathan's voice was thick with emotion. 24 years, and you were 20 miles away. I drove past your neighborhood probably 1,000 times, never knowing my daughter was growing up right under my nose." Lucia squeezed both their hands. "I used to drive past your hotel downtown sometimes. When Sofia was little, I'd point it out and tell her that important people worked there, that maybe someday she'd be important too. I never told her why I knew about that particular building. You told her about the hotel. I told her lots of things about you, without ever saying they were about you. Stories about a man I used to know who was kind and funny and smart, who loved flowers and old movies and made me laugh until my sides hurt. I wanted her to know what kind of man her father was, even if I couldn't tell her who he was." Sofia felt tears streaming down her face. All those stories about the friend from long ago. That was him. That was him. Jonathan looked between his daughter and the woman he'd never stopped loving, and felt something that had been broken inside him for 2 decades start to piece itself back together. "How much time do we have?" "Not enough," Lucia said simply. "But maybe enough to matter. I want to take care of you," Jonathan said, his voice urgent. "Both of you. I want to move you to a private room, get you the best doctors, try experimental treatments." "Jonathan," Lucia's voice was gentle but firm, "I'm past the point where better doctors can help. But Sofia could use a father. She's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for so long." Sofia looked at this man who was her father, this stranger with kind eyes and capable hands, and 24 years of love he'd never been able to give. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to have a father. I don't know how to be one," Jonathan said. "But maybe we can figure it out together." Outside the window, the Santa Fe sun was setting, painting the hospital room in shades of gold and amber. Inside, a family that had been broken apart by lies and fear, and the cruelty of people who thought they knew better was finally, tentatively, beginning to heal. There wasn't enough time. There would never be enough time. But for the first time in 24 years, Jonathan Blake was exactly where he belonged. The private room at Hopewell Medical Center looked nothing like the sterile box where Lucia had been fighting her battle alone. Jonathan had moved mountains in 48 hours, calling in favors, writing checks, transforming a standard hospital room into something that felt almost like home. Fresh flowers bloomed in crystal vases on every surface, their fragrance masking the antiseptic smell that had haunted Sofia's dreams for months. Soft lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence, and a comfortable recliner sat beside the hospital bed where Sofia could curl up with her mother during the long afternoons. But more than the physical changes, the room felt different because it was filled with something that had been missing for 24 years. The presence of family, complete and whole, even if only temporarily. "Tell me about kindergarten," Jonathan said, settling into his usual chair beside Lucia's bed. It was day 3 of what they'd all silently agreed to call their miracle time, the 15 precious days they would have together before Lucia's body gave up its fight. Sofia looked up from the photo albums she'd brought from home, chronicling a childhood her father had never seen. "Kindergarten was when I decided I wanted to be a teacher. Mrs. Rodriguez let me help the other kids with their letters, and I felt so important." "You were important," Lucia said softly, her voice weaker than it had been even 3 days earlier, but her eyes bright with the joy of watching her daughter and Jonathan discover each other. "You've always been important, Mija." Jonathan studied the photographs of Sofia's school plays, birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, a lifetime of moments he'd missed captured in fading snapshots. In every picture, Lucia was there, sometimes tired-looking, always smiling, always focused completely on her daughter. It broke his heart and filled it simultaneously. "What about high school?" he asked. "Did you date anyone I should know about?" Sofia laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. "Mom scared off most of the boys. She had this way of asking very pointed questions about their intentions." "I was protecting your virtue," Lucia protested with mock seriousness. "Someone had to make sure they were worthy of my daughter." "And were any of them worthy?" Jonathan asked. And Sofia was surprised by how natural it felt to have a father asking about her love life. How right it seemed to see him and her mother exchanging glances full of shared concern and amusement. "There was Miguel in senior year," Sofia admitted. "He lasted 6 months, which was a record. Mom actually liked him. He was a good boy," Lucia agreed. "He brought me flowers when he came to pick you up for dates. Carnations. Usually, not the most romantic choice, but thoughtful." Jonathan smiled. "Your mother always judged people by how they treated flowers. It was one of the first things I learned about her. Is that why you kept buying them every day at the shop?" "I bought them because I was falling in love with the woman who arranged them," Jonathan said, reaching over to take Lucia's hand. "The flowers were just my excuse to spend time with her. These were the conversations that filled their days, stories that wove together 3 separate lives into something that resembled a family history." Jonathan told Sofia about his childhood in the mansion she'd delivered packages to, about summers spent in Europe and winters in Aspen, about the loneliness of having everything except the people who mattered most. Sofia shared her own memories. Christmases celebrated with just her and her mother. Birthdays where Lucia somehow made $5 feel like 50. The way they'd created their own traditions and inside jokes and ways of navigating the world as a team of 2. And Lucia, growing weaker but somehow more vibrant than she'd been in months, served as the bridge between them, translating 23 years of separate experiences into a shared language of love. "I used to dream about this," Lucia confessed on day 7, watching Jonathan help Sofia with math homework on the small table the hospital had provided. He'd insisted on maintaining her normal routines, even hiring tutors to help her keep up with the community college classes she'd been forced to put on hold when her mother got sick. "What did you dream?" Sofia asked, looking up from her calculus problems. "This. The 3 of us together. You having a father to help with homework and to worry about boys and to teach you how to drive stick shift." Lucia's voice caught. "I used to lie awake at night imagining what our life would have been like if we'd been able to leave together that summer." Jonathan set down the pencil he'd been using to work through equations. "We would have moved to California, like we planned. Bought a little house near the beach, where Sofia could have grown up with sand between her toes. Would you have had more children?" Sofia asked, surprising herself with the question. Her parents looked at each other, and Sofia saw a whole conversation pass between them in silence. We talked about it, Lucia said finally. Before everything happened, we thought maybe 2 or 3 kids. Jonathan wanted to teach them all how to garden. I still do, Jonathan said quietly. I still want to teach you how to garden, if you're interested. The mansion has greenhouses that haven't been used in years. We could grow anything you wanted. Sofia felt her throat tighten. I'd like that. On day 10, Jonathan brought in specialists from Denver, then Los Angeles, then Houston. Each consultation ended the same way. Gentle words about comfort care and making the most of the time remaining. The cancer had spread too far, progressed too aggressively. All the money in the world couldn't buy more time, but it could buy comfort and dignity and the luxury of dying surrounded by love instead of fear. I need to tell you both something, Lucia said on day 12, her voice barely above a whisper. The pain medication made her drowsy, but she'd insisted on staying alert for this conversation. I need you to know that these 15 days have been the happiest of my life. Mom, Sofia started to protest, but Lucia raised a trembling hand. Let me finish, mija. I spent 24 years believing I'd destroyed all our chances for happiness. I thought I'd robbed you of a father and robbed Jonathan of a daughter, and that guilt was eating me alive faster than any cancer ever could. She looked at Jonathan, then at Sofia, then back at their joined hands on the hospital blanket. But seeing you two together, watching you discover each other, knowing that when I'm gone you'll still have each other, it's like finding out that the best parts of my life weren't actually over. They were just waiting. Jonathan brought Lucia's hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with infinite tenderness. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day in 24 years. I know, Lucia whispered. I could feel it sometimes, like warmth from a distant fire. It's what kept me going when things got really dark. On day 13, Sofia climbed into the hospital bed beside her mother for the first time since she was a small child. Curling up against Lucia's side while Jonathan held vigil in his chair, they watched old movies on the tablet he'd brought in, classics that Lucia and Jonathan had loved in their youth, stories about love that conquered all, happy endings that felt both impossible and inevitable. When I was little, I used to pretend my father was a prince in a faraway kingdom, Sofia said during a quiet moment between films. I thought maybe he couldn't come for us because he was fighting dragons or saving other people. Maybe I was, Jonathan said softly. Maybe I was fighting the dragon of not knowing where you were, and you were saving me by growing up to be exactly the person I needed to meet. Day 14 brought a moment of crystal clarity for Lucia, a last gift from a body that had been failing for months. She sat up straighter than she had in weeks, her eyes bright and focused, and asked Jonathan to bring her the small wooden box she kept in her bedside table at home. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written on flower shop stationery and hotel letterhead, all addressed to "My dearest Jonathan," or "My beautiful daughter," and never sent. I wrote to you both every year on Sofia's birthday, Lucia explained. Letters I could never mail, but I needed to write them anyway. I needed you to know that not a day passed when I didn't think about what we could have been. They spent that evening reading 23 years of love letters aloud, filling in the gaps in their shared story with words that had been waiting 2 decades to be heard. On the morning of day 15, Sofia Bennett closed her eyes with her daughter's hand in her left hand and Jonathan Blake's hand in her right. Surrounded by the family she'd sacrificed everything to protect, and finally, miraculously, been able to give back to each other. The last thing she heard was Sofia's voice, soft and steady, saying, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you for loving us enough to let us find each other." The morning sun filtered through the hospital room windows with a gentleness that seemed wrong for such a momentous day. Sofia Bennett died at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, slipping away as quietly as she had lived most of her adult life, without fanfare, without demands for attention, surrounded by the 2 people who had made her existence meaningful. Sofia felt the exact moment her mother's spirit left. It wasn't dramatic. No final words, no struggle, no Hollywood death scene. Lucia simply exhaled, a long, peaceful breath that seemed to carry 24 years of held secrets with it. And then there was stillness. Her face, which had been etched with pain for months, smoothed into something that looked almost like contentment. Jonathan was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's free now." Sofia nodded, unable to trust her voice. She kept holding her mother's hand, which was already growing cold, as if she could anchor Lucia's soul to earth through sheer force of will. But there was a peace in the room that hadn't been there before, as if all the tension that had been building for 15 days had finally been released. She waited, Sofia said finally. She waited until we found each other. She was always protecting us, Jonathan agreed, reaching across Lucia's still form to touch Sofia's shoulder. Even at the end, she was making sure we'd be okay. The next hours passed in a blur of hospital protocols and funeral arrangements. Jonathan handled most of the logistics with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex situations, but he consulted Sofia on every decision. What kind of service would Lucia have wanted? Where should she be buried? What flowers should they choose? White roses, Sofia said when they met with the funeral director. She always said white roses meant new beginnings. And baby's breath, Jonathan added. She used to say it represented eternal love. The funeral director, a kind woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been handling Santa Fe's griefs for 30 years, nodded solemnly. It sounds like she was lucky to have two people who knew her so well. Sofia and Jonathan exchanged glances. 3 days ago, they'd been strangers. Now they were united in grief and love, and the shared responsibility of honoring a woman who'd sacrificed everything for both of them. The service was scheduled for Friday morning at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, where Lucia had attended Mass sporadically over the years. Word spread through Santa Fe's tight-knit community with the speed that news always traveled in small cities. The delivery girl's mother had died, and somehow the reclusive hotel magnate was paying for everything. But it was more than just paying for the funeral that caught people's attention. It was the way Jonathan Blake, who hadn't been seen in public for months, stood beside Sofia Bennett like a proud father, his hand on her shoulder as they greeted mourners. It was the way he introduced her to people as my daughter, without elaboration, as if daring anyone to question the claim. How long has he known? Whispered Maria Santos, who owned the bakery where Sofia sometimes bought day-old bread when money was particularly tight. That's not our business, her husband replied, but his eyes were curious too. Everyone had questions, but no one was bold enough to ask them directly. The church filled with people Sofia barely recognized. Customers from her delivery route, nurses and doctors from the hospital, neighbors who'd watched her grow up from a distance. But in the front row sat an unexpected guest, Evelyn Blake, looking frail and ancient in her wheelchair, her face etched with a grief that seemed to go deeper than sympathy for strangers. Sofia noticed her during the service but didn't understand the significance until afterward. When Jonathan wheeled his mother over to where Sofia stood accepting condolences. "Sofia," Evelyn said, her voice tremulous with age and emotion. "I'm so very sorry for your loss. Your mother she was an extraordinary woman." Sofia looked between Evelyn and Jonathan, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Blake. I came because I owed it to her," Evelyn said, her words barely audible above the murmur of the departing crowd. "I owed it to both of you, and because I needed to ask for your forgiveness." "Mother," Jonathan warned, but Evelyn raised a shaking hand. "No, Jonathan. She has a right to know who I am, what I did." Evelyn looked directly at Sofia, her blue eyes swimming with tears. "I'm the reason you grew up without a father, child. I'm the reason your mother carried those secrets all these years." Sofia felt Jonathan stiffen beside her, but she kept her attention focused on the elderly woman in the wheelchair. "You're the one who threatened her." "Yes." The word came out like a sob. "Yes, and I've regretted it every day since. I thought I was protecting my son, protecting our family's reputation. But I destroyed 3 lives instead. 4 lives. Sofia corrected quietly. "You destroyed your own life too. Jonathan told me you've been miserable for decades." Evelyn's composure cracked completely. "I've been in hell. Every night, I see her face, so young and scared when we went to her apartment. Every morning, I wake up knowing I stole 24 years from all of you." Sofia looked at this broken old woman and felt something unexpected. Pity. Evelyn Blake had wealth, status, everything that was supposed to matter, but she'd been living with the weight of her cruelty for nearly a quarter century. In some ways, she'd been more trapped by her choices than anyone. "She forgave you," Sofia said finally. "In the hospital, before she died, Mom told me she forgave everyone who'd hurt her. She said, Carrying anger was too heavy, and she was too tired to carry it anymore. Evelyn sobbed openly now, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. She was a better person than I ever was. Yes, Sofia agreed simply. She was, but she also taught me that forgiveness isn't about deserving it. It's about letting go of things that hurt us. Jonathan knelt beside his mother's wheelchair, taking her hands in his. Mom, we'll have time to talk about this later. About forgiveness, about moving forward. But today is about honoring Lucia. Evelyn nodded, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. Yes, of course. I needed her to know that I was sorry. As the crowd thinned, Sofia and Jonathan found themselves alone beside Lucia's casket, which was covered in white roses and baby's breath exactly as they'd requested. The flowers filled the church with a fragrance that reminded Sofia of her mother's hands, always smelling faintly of whatever blossoms she'd been arranging at the flower shop all those years ago. She would have liked this, Sofia said, touching one of the rose petals. All these people coming to remember her. She touched more lives than she knew, Jonathan agreed. Mrs. Rodriguez from the funeral home told me that 3 different families offered to help pay for the service. People whose packages you delivered, who remembered your kindness even when you were struggling. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the woman who'd brought them together, even as she was leaving them behind. What happens now? Sofia asked eventually. Jonathan looked at his daughter. The words still felt new and wonderful in his mind, and saw Lucia's strength in the set of her shoulders, her own determination in the way she'd faced this terrible week with grace. Now we learn how to be a family, he said. Now we make sure your mother's sacrifice meant something. 3 days later, at 2:30 in the afternoon, Evelyn Blake died in her sleep. The nurse found her clutching a photograph of Jonathan as a baby, a peaceful expression on her face that her son hadn't seen since before his father died. She was waiting too, Jonathan told Sofia, as they stood in his mother's room at the assisted living facility, waiting to ask for forgiveness, waiting to see that we'd found each other. Sofia looked around the sparse room, noting the absence of luxury that had characterized the rest of Evelyn's life. Do you think she was happy at the end? I think she was relieved, Jonathan said. I think she finally let herself believe that love was stronger than the mistakes she made trying to control it. They buried Evelyn Blake beside her husband in the family plot at Rosario Cemetery, in a service attended by the board members of various charitable organizations and a handful of society friends who remembered when the Blake name meant something different in Santa Fe. But Sofia stood beside Jonathan throughout the service, and when people asked who she was, he introduced her the same way he had at her mother's funeral. This is my daughter. No one questioned it anymore. The resemblance was too strong, the claim too confidently made. And besides, in a week when 2 women had died carrying secrets that spanned decades, Santa Fe was ready to accept that some stories were more complicated than they appeared on the surface. As they walked away from Evelyn's grave, Sofia slipped her hand into Jonathan's. Is it over now? All the secrets, all the guilt. The secrets are over, Jonathan said, squeezing her fingers. Now we get to start the part where we live. The Blake mansion felt different with Sofia living in it. What had been a mausoleum of memories for 24 years was slowly transforming into something that resembled an actual home. Jonathan found himself smiling at unexpected moments. When he heard Sofia's music drifting down from the guest room that was becoming her room. When he discovered her textbooks spread across the dining room table she'd claimed as her study space. When he walked into the kitchen to find her making coffee at 6 in the morning before her first class. You don't have to keep working, he'd told her a dozen times in the 2 months since the funerals. You could focus on school full-time, or take a break, or figure out what you really want to do. I want to work, Sofia always replied, but maybe not delivering packages forever. She'd kept her job with the courier service, but only part-time now, and only because she enjoyed the independence it gave her. Jonathan had wanted to pay off all her mother's medical bills immediately, had tried to set up trust funds and college accounts and all the financial cushions that money could provide. But Sofia approached her new wealth the way she approached everything else, carefully, thoughtfully, refusing to let it change her fundamental sense of who she was. Mom raised me to work for what I want, she explained. When Jonathan expressed frustration with her insistence on maintaining some level of financial independence, I'm not going to dishonor that by becoming someone who just expects things to be handed to her. You're my daughter, Jonathan said. Everything I have is yours by right. Everything you have is yours because you earned it, Sofia corrected. If I want my own things, I should earn them too. It was quintessentially Lucia, this stubborn pride wrapped in practicality, and it made Jonathan's chest tight with love and loss. Every time Sofia displayed it, she was so much her mother's daughter, but he was beginning to see pieces of himself in her too, the way she approached problems methodically, her dry sense of humor when she was comfortable, the fierce loyalty she showed to people she cared about, the mansion staff, reduced over the years to just Mrs. Carmen, who came twice a week to clean, and Eduardo, who maintained the grounds, were delighted by Sofia's presence. She insisted on learning their names, asked about their families, and horrified them by trying to do her own laundry and clean her own room. "Señorita Sofia," Mrs. Carmen protested in her heavily accented English, "you don't need to strip the bed. That's what I'm here for." "I've been stripping my own bed for 23 years, Mrs. Carmen," Sofia replied with a smile. "I'm not going to stop now and make you do extra work. Your father, he pays me to do the work. Then let me help you, and we'll get it done faster. And you can go home early to your grandchildren." Jonathan found them together one afternoon, Mrs. Carmen teaching Sofia how to arrange flowers in the crystal vases that had sat empty in the main hall for years. They were laughing about something, their heads bent together over white roses and baby's breath, and Jonathan had to grip the doorframe to steady himself against the wave of emotion that crashed over him. "She's good for this house," Mrs. Carmen said later, finding Jonathan in his study. "This place, it's been too quiet too long. Houses need young people to keep them alive." Jonathan nodded, not trusting his voice. The house did feel alive again. But more than that, he felt alive again. For the first time in 24 years, he was looking forward instead of backward, planning for a future instead of mourning a past. "I want to show you something," he told Sofia one evening after dinner. He led her through parts of the mansion she hadn't explored yet, past the formal rooms that were still draped in the careful perfection his mother had maintained, to a wing that had been closed off for years. "This was going to be the nursery," he said, opening the door to a room filled with dusty furniture covered in white sheets. "When your mother and I were planning to elope, I used to come in here and imagine what it would look like. I bought furniture, painted the walls yellow because we didn't know if you were going to be a boy or a girl." Sofia walked into the room slowly, pulling sheets off a crib, a changing table, a rocking chair that looked like it had never been used. Everything was perfect, preserved like a shrine to a future that had never happened. "You kept all this. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it, even after I thought you'd never exist. I couldn't. It was the only piece of you I had." Sofia sat down in the rocking chair, testing its gentle motion. "What were you going to name me?" "We had a list." Jonathan smiled at the memory. "Isabel, if you were a girl, after your grandmother on your mother's side. Miguel if you were a boy, after mine. But your mother also liked Sofia. She said it meant wisdom, and she wanted you to be wiser than we were. She got her wish," Sofia said softly. "I would have run away with you. If someone had threatened my family, I would have told you, and let you fight for us instead of fighting alone. Maybe that's exactly why she named you Sofia," Jonathan said. "Maybe she knew you'd need that wisdom for something we couldn't imagine yet." They spent the evening transforming the nursery into something new, not the baby room it had been intended to be, but a sitting room where Sofia could read and study, where they could talk about the day over coffee, where the future could finally take root in a space that had been trapped in the past for too long. "I've been thinking about school," Sofia said, as they worked together to move furniture, "about what I want to study." "What are you thinking?" "Social work. Maybe family counseling. I keep thinking about how many people out there are carrying secrets like Mom did, feeling trapped by circumstances they can't control. Maybe I could help them find better solutions than she had." Jonathan paused in his arrangement of the bookshelf they'd moved from storage. "That sounds perfect. That sounds exactly like something you'd be brilliant at. It would mean more school, a bachelor's degree, then a master's program, maybe 6 years total. And..." Sofia looked at him with something that might have been vulnerability. "And I was wondering if you'd want to help. Not just financially, but Maybe you could teach me some things about business, about managing money, about how to build something that lasts. Sofia. Jonathan set down the book he'd been holding and looked directly at his daughter. I would be honored to teach you anything you want to learn. I would be honored to help you build whatever kind of life you want, even if it's not the life you imagined for your daughter, even if I don't want to take over your hotels or live in mansions or any of that. Jonathan thought about the dreams he'd had for Sofia when she was just a possibility in his mind. Vague fantasies about teaching her to ride horses, helping her with homework, walking her down the aisle at her wedding. None of those dreams had included social work or family counseling, or a daughter who insisted on making her own way in the world. But looking at Sofia now, strong and determined, and so obviously her mother's daughter, he realized his old dreams had been too small anyway, especially if it's not the life I imagined, he said. The life I imagined was based on a little girl I'd never met. The life you're choosing is based on the woman you actually are, and that woman is extraordinary. Sofia's smile lit up the room. I want to start a foundation too, something in Mom's name, to help single mothers who are struggling, maybe provide legal aid or financial assistance, or just resources so they don't have to face things alone the way she did. The Sofia Bennett Foundation, Jonathan said immediately. I love it. We could start it tomorrow if you want. You don't think I'm going to let you do all the important work while I just sit around managing hotels, do you? Jonathan grinned. Besides, someone needs to teach you how to navigate nonprofit law and board governance and all the boring administrative stuff that makes foundations actually functional. They worked until midnight, planning and dreaming, and building something new from the pieces of their shared loss. When Sofia finally went upstairs to bed, Jonathan stood in the former nursery, now a room where the future lived instead of the past, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 24 years. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose, not the end of missing Lucia, but the beginning of honoring her by loving the daughter she'd raised and protected and given back to him. For the first time since he was 21 years old, Jonathan Blake went to sleep without looking at Lucia's photograph, because he'd spent the day looking at her legacy instead. 6 months after the deaths that had both ended and begun their story, Sofia and Jonathan stood at the gates of Rosario Cemetery, carrying white roses and baby's breath. The Santa Fe morning was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the cottonwood trees that lined the cemetery paths had begun their slow transformation from green to gold. They visited the graves every month, sometimes together, sometimes separately, but always with flowers. Today felt different, though, heavier with significance, as if the earth itself knew they were approaching some kind of anniversary that mattered more than calendar dates could measure. Lucia's headstone was simple. Lucia Santos Bennett, beloved mother, 1978-2023, she loved completely. Beneath her name, they'd had the stonecutter add a line in Spanish that Sofia had chosen, El amor verdadero nunca muere, true love never dies. I graduated, Sofia said to the headstone, settling cross-legged on the grass beside her mother's grave the way she used to sit beside Lucia's hospital bed. Top of my class in the social work program, Jonathan cried at the ceremony, which was embarrassing, but also kind of wonderful. Jonathan placed his roses on the grave and sat down beside Sofia. I did not cry. I got something in my eye. You sobbed, Sofia said with affection. Mrs. Carmen had to give you tissues. Details, Jonathan muttered. But he was smiling. The easy banter between them had developed over months of learning how to be father and daughter, how to navigate the complicated dance of building a relationship from scratch while honoring the woman who'd made it possible. The foundation is officially launching next week, Sofia continued, addressing the headstone as if Lucia could hear every word. We've got legal aid attorneys, financial counselors, child care assistants, and emergency housing support for single mothers. Jonathan keeps insisting we need more staff, but I think we should start small and grow organically. Your daughter has very strong opinions about organizational development, Jonathan told Lucia's grave. I wonder where she gets that from. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning sun climb higher over the cemetery. Other visitors moved between the graves, elderly men tending to wives' flowers, young families teaching children how to remember grandparents they'd barely known, people carrying their own complicated stories of love and loss, and the weight of continuing without the people who'd shaped them. I have something to tell you both, Sofia said finally, her voice carrying the kind of nervous excitement that made Jonathan look at her sharply. Good news or bad news? Good news, I think. Sofia took a deep breath. David proposed. Jonathan blinked. David was Sofia's boyfriend of 4 months, a fellow social worker she'd met during her graduate program. He was kind, intelligent, and absolutely devoted to Sofia, in a way that reminded Jonathan painfully of his younger self with Lucia. But 4 months seemed awfully quick for marriage proposals. And, Jonathan asked carefully, and I said yes. Sofia's smile was radiant. I know it's fast, but Mom, you always told me that when you know, and I know. Jonathan felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy for his daughter's happiness, protectiveness that wanted to question whether 4 months was really enough time to know someone, and a deep sadness that Lucia wouldn't be there to help plan a wedding or meet the man Sofia had chosen to spend her life with. Tell me about him, Jonathan said. Tell your mother about him. Sofia's face lit up in a way that erased all of Jonathan's concerns about timing. He's nothing like what I thought I wanted, she said. He's quiet where I'm loud, careful where I'm impulsive. He grew up in foster care, so he understands what it's like to build family from choice instead of obligation. And he makes me laugh. Mom, even when I'm crying about missing you, he finds ways to make me laugh. What does he do? Jonathan asked. He runs a nonprofit that helps kids age out of foster care. We met when our organizations were collaborating on a project. Sofia turned to look at Jonathan. He's not wealthy, and he'll probably never be wealthy. His biggest ambition is to make sure no kid in New Mexico has to face adulthood completely alone. Is that going to be a problem? Jonathan thought about his own parents, who'd valued bank accounts over character, who'd destroyed lives in the name of protecting social status. He thought about the 24 years he'd lost, because people had decided his happiness mattered less than his family's reputation. The only thing that would be a problem, he said firmly, is if he doesn't make you happy. Everything else is just details. Sofia's smile could have powered the entire city. He makes me incredibly happy, and he's excited to meet you properly. We've been talking about having dinner at the house next week, if you're ready for that. I'm ready, Jonathan said. More than ready. They arranged the flowers on Lucia's grave with the precision of people who'd performed this ritual many times before. White roses for new beginnings, baby's breath for eternal love, and a single red carnation that Sofia always added, for a mother's love that death couldn't diminish. We should visit Evelyn too, Sofia said as they finished with the flowers. Evelyn's grave was a short walk away, in the Blake family section where generations of Santa Fe's elite were buried beneath expensive headstones and elaborate monuments. Her stone was simpler than her husband's. At Jonathan's request, Evelyn Morrison Blake, 1945 to 2023, she found peace at last. I brought you something, Sofia said, kneeling beside the grave and pulling a small framed photograph from her purse. It was a picture from her college graduation, showing her and Jonathan together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. I thought you should see how we turned out, Sofia said to the headstone. I know you made terrible choices, but I also know you loved Jonathan in your own way. And I think maybe, at the end, you understood that love means letting people choose their own happiness. Jonathan knelt beside Sofia, touching the cold marble of his mother's headstone. I forgive you, Mom, he said quietly. Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger was keeping me from being the father Sofia deserves. They placed flowers on Evelyn's grave too. White roses and baby's breath, the same flowers that decorated Lucia's resting place. Because forgiveness, Sofia had learned from her mother, wasn't about deserving it. It was about choosing to lay down burdens that were too heavy to carry. As they walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Sofia slipped her arm through Jonathan's. Dad, she said, and the word still made his heart skip even after 6 months of hearing it. I need to ask you something. Anything. Will you walk me down the aisle? At the wedding? Jonathan stopped walking, overwhelmed by the simple request that represented everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. Sofia, I would be honored. Good, because I already told David you would, and he's planning to ask you for your blessing next week at dinner. Jonathan laughed, a sound that echoed off the cemetery monuments and scattered a family of ravens from a nearby oak tree. You've got this all figured out, don't you? I learned from the best, Sofia said, looking back toward her mother's grave. She taught me that life is too short to waste time on fear, that love is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the best families are the ones you build from the pieces of your broken heart. They reached Jonathan's car, but neither of them moved to get in. The cemetery felt peaceful in the morning light, full of stories about people who'd loved and lost, and found ways to continue living anyway. "Do you think she knows?" Sofia asked. "About the engagement, about the foundation, about us being okay?" Jonathan looked back at the hillside where Sofia Bennett lay beneath flowers and memories, where Evelyn Blake rested beside the husband she'd loved imperfectly, where dozens of other families' stories were written in stone and remembered in visits. "I think she's been watching over us this whole time," he said. "I think she's the reason you found my house that day, the reason you saw her picture, the reason everything happened exactly when it needed to happen." Sofia smiled, following his gaze toward the graves they'd left behind. "Then she knows we're going to be okay." "More than okay," Jonathan agreed, opening the car door for his daughter. "We're going to be extraordinary." As they drove away from Rosario Cemetery, past the cottonwoods that were teaching Autumn how to be beautiful, Sofia Bennett, soon to be Sophia Chen, looked forward to a future that included a father who loved her, a husband who understood her, and work that honored her mother's memory by helping other families find better endings to their stories. In the rearview mirror, the cemetery grew smaller, but the love it held grew larger, following them home.